I'll call the meeting to order. This special meeting of the Desert Community College District Board of Trustees is now called to order at 9, we'll say 35. You may join today's meeting in person via Zoom webinar or watch the live stream from the College of the Desert YouTube channel. These links are accessible by visiting the College of the Desert homepage. And roll call. Dr. Garcia, please proceed with roll call.
Good morning, Student Trustee Paul, Trustee Perez, Trustee Kinnaman,
Present.
Trustee Gonzalez,
Good morning, President.
Trustee Young, Trustee Stefan.
Present. And now we'll have the Pledge of Allegiance, and if I could have Trustee Gonzalez lead us in that, I'd appreciate it. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Agenda 2.01, board meeting agenda. Pursuant to the Government Code Section 54954.2B2, the board may take action on items of business not appearing on the posted agenda upon a determination by a 2/3 vote of the board, or if less than 2/3 of the members are present, a unanimous vote of those present, that there is a need to take immediate action and that the need for action came to the attention of the local agency subsequent to the agenda being posted as specified. Confirmation of agenda. Are there any additions, corrections, or deletions to the agenda through the March 8th, 2023 meeting?
None.
Hearing none, the agenda stands approved as presented. And at this time, we'll open up the floor for public comments. In-person and remote public participation is allowed and will be accepted in person by email to otp@collegeofthedesert.edu and submitted for the record during public comments or by using the raise your hand function by joining the Zoom link. There's a time limit of 3 minutes per person. All comments must be submitted or brought forward prior to the end of the public comments section. Are there any public comments that have been received?
There are no public comments today.
Thank you. And that brings us into our study session. The board training, role of the board, Brown Act, and privileges. At this time, I'd like to welcome Eileen O'Hare Anderson with Liebert, Cassidy, and Whitmore to present this item. We're very glad to have you here.
There we go. Yes, I have an advanced degree. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. I am a bit of a geek. I do enjoy the Brown Act. More accurately, I have a love-hate relationship with the Brown Act. My style is to take questions throughout as we go. I think that's the best way to make sure I'm meeting everyone's expectations. So please, trustees, ask questions as we go along. Our agenda for today, well, first let me introduce myself. I've been before you before, but I'm Eileen O'Hare Anderson. I'm a partner in the Fresno office of Liebert, Cassidy, Whitmore. I've been practicing, I can't believe it when I say this, almost 31 years. It'll be 31 years this year. And clearly I was 10 years old when I graduated from law school. I'm gonna have to change that joke. I think I'm gonna have to start going for 20 years. Most of that time I've been practicing with the community college districts. So this is my jam. This is what I do. And I tell people I have the best job in the world because I never have to talk my clients into doing the right thing. Sometimes it takes us a minute to figure out what the right thing is, but then my clients just go do it. And I don't know a lot of lawyers who can say that, so I really do think I have the best job in the world. Today we're going to talk about Brown Act, and the role of the board. We're going to talk a little bit about privilege, both the closed session privilege and a little bit about attorney-client privilege as well. But our agenda is as you see it. We're going to talk about governance issues, some board role questions, ethics. We're going to talk about your board policy and administrative procedure 2715. We're going to talk about efficacy issues that come up in board meetings. And then we're going to talk about Brown Act, the latest teleconference amendments, and then closed session, what's appropriate in closed session, what happens in closed session, that kind of thing. So let's start with board governance, and this may be a review for most of you. Probably all of you know quite a bit about board governance, but a quorum is a simple majority of the board. For your district, I don't know why I'm referencing another district in these slides, but for your district, that means 3 trustees. You have a 5-member board. Quorum would be 3 trustees. You can only hold a meeting and act when you have a quorum present. It takes a quorum to hold a meeting. The flip side of that is, as we'll talk when we get into the Brown Act part of this, when you have a quorum, you have a meeting. So you have to have a quorum to meet, but when you do have a quorum, it is a meeting. So we'll talk about what that means as far as Brown Act issues when we get there. According to the Brown Act, according to the Education Code, you act by a majority of all of the trustees. So if you have 3 trustees present, that's a quorum, you can go forward with your meeting, but you need all 3 votes to take action. It's a majority of the entire board, not just a majority of those who are present. Some actions, there are a few, not very many. Some actions require a supermajority, 2/3. There's even 1 or 2 actions that a board could take that require a unanimous vote. Those don't come up very often. They mostly have to do with land, leasing, granting easements. The one that I think I remember being unanimous is leasing mineral rights or gas rights under district property. Not something that comes up very often. Just to flag that there are some times when you need more than a simple majority. But those are set out in your board policy, and your staff will flag those for you. So the mission of community colleges generally is to provide lifelong learning, to be the accessible option. I like to say that we are an institution of second chances. I think the community colleges, and I am an alum, West Valley in the house. I think that the California community colleges are among the most small d democratic institutions in the country, because we take anyone on wherever they are. We meet our students where they are, and we take all comers. So open admission, all are welcome. We provide a diverse staff to educate our diverse students. Equity is a core value. It's an important value from the system office. It's an important value for all of us as well. And then we provide supports to our students to ensure success. I'm not telling any of you anything you don't already know, better than I probably. The structure within the college, so the board is voted by the electors. You are elected by the community you represent. The trustees in turn then hire and oversee and evaluate the superintendent president. The superintendent president is your primary, really your only direct report, and then Dr. Garcia works with her staff and further delegates her responsibilities to her vice presidents, remaining accountable always, but delegating authority to go out and conduct the business of the district. All right, board roles. As I said, you are the lay trustees who represent the community, who are responsible for the operation of the district. You are the bridge between the community and the district. Your important roles are to monitor the operation of the district at a very high level, to create a climate for student success, for student education. The board acts as one body. An individual trustee has no more power than any member of the community who walks in off the street. The power of the board comes when you get a majority vote. Your primary, in a lot of ways, in most ways, your primary responsibility is to create policies at the 30,000-foot level that drive the mission, drive the programs of the district. So you have a board policy on board duties. It's Board Policy 2200. These are not verbatim, these bullet points are not verbatim, but they are from your board policy. You are responsible to represent the public interest, to establish policies and set standards, to hire and evaluate the superintendent president. You delegate power and authority to the superintendent president. And again, Dr. Garcia is responsible to the board for that delegation. You ensure the fiscal health and stability of the district, monitor the performance, and advocate and protect the district. You advocate on behalf of the district and help protect the district through your board policies and through your actions at your board meetings. So we talked about delegation of authority to the superintendent president. You have a board policy on that as well, 2430. The board delegates responsibility for the day-to-day operation to the superintendent president. The superintendent president, in turn, further delegates that to vice presidents, but is responsible to the board for how that delegated authority is exercised. Dr. Garcia is responsible for interpreting and applying board policy. If there is a question about what a board policy means, Dr. Garcia is responsible to make that determination, and if necessary, to bring that board policy back to you and point out, look, there's an ambiguity here, or this is not clear, or this isn't working, and to recommend to you revisions to your policies. And in fact, she acts as the board's advisor on policy matters. And I know that you subscribe to the Community College League's Policy and Procedure Service. That's a program that's very close to my heart. And part of that service is twice a year you get updates. To various policies and procedure templates that have been necessary because of changes in the law, cases that have come out that have made us revise or recommend revision to board policies. And there is an ongoing, in the accreditation requirements, there is a requirement for ongoing continuous review of your policies. And that is an important role of the board. One of the things accreditation teams look for is, are your policies up to date? Have they been reviewed within the last accreditation cycle? Are we keeping them current with changes in the law? Are there policies in place that ensure the financial stability of the district? Are there policies that show that we are dedicating appropriate resources to various functions on the campus? All of those are important parts of the accreditation requirements. The board acts, as I said, through a majority, so you act as a collective entity. And once the board makes a decision, all trustees are expected to support that decision in public. That's an important role of the board. We talked about keeping your policies and procedures up to date. We talked about the need to hire and evaluate the superintendent president. Equally important is that the board present, support the decisions of the board when arrived at through a majority action of the board. There's another accreditation requirement for having a clearly articulated and defined process for selecting and evaluating your superintendent president. You have a board, I didn't make a note of the board policy number, but you have a board policy on CEO selection. And that is all good. Another accreditation requirement is to have a board code of ethics and conflict of interest policy, and to have a mechanism in place for enforcing that. The board does that through Board Policy and Administrative Procedure 2715. I have a few slides about that. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. Again, it's an accreditation requirement that the board delegate responsibility to the CEO, the superintendent president. That is something I have seen accrediting visiting teams looking at, and in fact making recommendations or even more severe comments in the accreditation reports is if boards become too enmeshed in the operational detail of the district. I've seen that show up as a micromanaging finding in the accreditation report. And you are, lastly, you are responsible to know the accreditation process and to know your accreditation status. What is the district's status with the accrediting body? So from time to time, I get a question about the power of an individual trustee. I'll get a call from someone, often from someone in HR, and the HR officer will say, trustee so-and-so just showed up in my office and wants to see a personnel file. Can I show it to her? Trustee so-and-so wants to see some other confidential document. Can I show it to him? And the answer is generally no. An individual trustee can't come in and demand to see a personnel file any more than somebody walking in off the street could do that. What I advise the staff and the HR officer and the CEO is, if that happens, put something on the agenda in closed session, public employment or public appointment, whatever the question is that raised the need to see the personnel file, put that on the agenda and bring the personnel file into closed session and say, trustees, one of you has asked to see the personnel file of this employee. I have brought the personnel file with me. Is it the will of the board that trustee so-and-so review this personnel file? Because an individual trustee doesn't have that authority unless it's formally delegated to him or her by the board through an action. So sometimes we see a delegation, a board will set up a subcommittee, or will say to the board president or the board vice president or another trustee, can you go look at the history of whatever and come bring a report back to us? Then that's an appropriate because there's been a delegation like that, then it's appropriate, but otherwise not. All right, I promised you some slides on the board's statement of ethics and board policy 2715. The board's policymaking duties, I divided these into categories. The first is board policymaking duties. The board's primary function is to establish policy. It provides oversight of the board, of the district rather, through its policy setting function. It emphasizes the quality of the instruction, the quality of student learning, the integrity of the program, the instructional programs, the operational efficiency and fiscal stability of the district. Fiscal stability is an important theme in the accrediting standards. There are quite a few standards that focus around fiscal stability, and it's become, if I hear one more time about the fiscal cliff, I think I'll run screaming from the building. But it's becoming an important issue, and I think it will become even more so in the next year or two. Other board policy-making duties, the board is really focused on that policy determination, the planning, and other planning functions, such as facilities planning and budgetary planning, and again, maintaining the fiscal stability of the district. The board does not get involved in operational detail. I like, in some of my trainings, I like to talk about, board members having opinions about how often the grounds should be maintained. I use a very old-fashioned example. How often are we mowing the lawns? That is the kind of operational detail that the board should not be getting into. If you have concerns, if you as trustees have concerns about maintenance or operations or whatever, HR, fiscal, whatever, your role is to bring those to your CEO, who will bring back answers to you by way of her subordinate reports. So, if it's a lawn mowing question, we'll bring that answer back to you up through the chain from the director of grounds. It's not appropriate, and really it's not kind to staff to bring a question directly to staff. You as trustees have quite a bit of power and authority, and a grounds worker who gets a call or a grounds supervisor who gets a call from a trustee saying, hey, why are the sprinklers going off on the south lawn at 2 o'clock in the afternoon? That is really concerning to the grounds supervisor. That is going to cause quite a bit of stress and anxiety for that employee. It's better to take those questions down through the superintendent president and to the operational level that way. Another theme in your statement of ethics is relationships with the superintendent president. Again, the board policy talks about delegating authority to the superintendent president, but it also talks about promoting a healthy working relationship through supportive, honest, open communication. There's a comment in there about regular evaluation, and I know that many CEOs across the state feel that they don't get enough evaluation, that they don't get the kind of ongoing evaluation that we preach our managers should be giving to their employees. You as a board should also be giving ongoing evaluation comments about positives and challenges, both. And I know, I have not discussed this issue with Dr. Garcia, but I have discussed it with a number of CEOs, and many of them feel that is one area they wish their boards were doing better on, providing feedback, as I said, both positive and negative, throughout the year. And that is what we teach our managers and supervisors to do. All right. Another area, this is not a term that's used in your board policy, but it is a concept that I have overlaid on some of these bullet points, is trusteeship. You know, the art of being a trustee. It's not something that comes naturally necessarily, but there is a requirement, a duty established in your board policy to acknowledge that the board represents the entire community and not simply those who voted for you, but all members of the community. And you owe your community your independent judgment. That's what you have said through your board policy. You also have a duty to avoid conflicts of interest or the appearance of conflicts of interest. And I will be back before you very soon, I think on Monday, to provide a conflicts of interest training as now required by California law. Bring your snacks, but bring the popcorn, that one's a barn burner. So we'll talk more about conflicts of interest. You also have an obligation to act in the best interests of the district and not to use your position for personal gain or personal prestige or advancing your own agenda, whether that's a personal agenda or a political agenda or any other type of agenda. You have an obligation, a duty to avoid the perception of favoritism, that you favor one person or one group over another. The flip side of that is you have an obligation to avoid a perception of animus or ill will towards one person or one program or one group, whatever it might be. You have an obligation to get along, to play nicely in the sandbox, to develop a good relationship with each other so that you're able to communicate openly. And we'll talk in a minute. A board of trustees is a unique creature, right? You cannot meet privately except for very limited circumstances. You have to conduct your business meeting in front of all of us. So you can't really have moments when you're alone and developing your relationships. You need to do that in board meetings and in front of the public. And that's a very odd concept. But I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to the efficacy part of our presentation. You also have an obligation to keep an open mind, to come to the board meetings, having done your read the materials provided to you and ready to make a decision, but not yet solidified in an opinion. Of course, you will have opinions and you'll be leaning one way or the other, but you need to come to a board meeting with an open mind and willing to hear both from the staff, the administration, members of the community who will come to you in a public comment, and from each other, right? So it's typically not helpful to come in to a particular issue with a solidified opinion. You should be willing to hear each other and the other constituencies. You have an obligation to attend board meetings, to be informed about the issues that both come before you and issues that are in the community that might affect the district. There may not, I'm going to use a silly example, there may not be a board item that comes before you about updating the buggy whip program. But if you're hearing in the community that there is a great need for buggy whip manufacturing, and I know I said it was a silly example, but if you hear that out in the community, you have an obligation to bring that forward and ask that that be put on the agenda, or ask for a report about that. So you're really a conduit both ways. You're bringing information from the community to the board, to the district as a whole, and to the board in particular, and vice versa. You're bringing information out into the community. All right, we've talked about this a number of times already. You exercise power as a majority. The board only acts when there's a majority of the board. An individual member does not have any power as an individual. You uphold and support the majority of decisions of the board. Once the board decides, that is the decision of the district. And you could have an obligation to comply with the Brown Act. And of course, we'll have the second-ish part of this presentation this morning will be Brown Act. All Brown Act, all the time. All right. Another element of governance issues is the information. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about the Brown Act, but you have an obligation to maintain the confidences of closed session. So the information that comes to you in closed session is privileged often in two ways. So in general, there is a privilege for information in the information that is provided to you in the closed session. You know, you may be getting information about your labor negotiations position, or your strategy for labor negotiations, or your strategy for addressing a grievance, or you may be getting information about personnel items, discipline, or something like that. Or you might be getting information about litigation to which the district is a party. Either you've initiated litigation or you're being sued. Those are all that information is confidential. But in addition, there is a privilege called the deliberative process privilege for the conversations that you all have in closed session as you come to decisions on those matters. So that is a privilege that the district holds, not any one individual member. So you have that privileged information. And in addition, as I said, you often get attorney-client privileged information. Your lawyer may come to you and tell you about a grievance that's pending, or a lawsuit that's pending against you, and may have a very frank discussion with you about, these are our strengths and these are our weaknesses. And you know, we as lawyers can only do that well when there is a privilege, when we are able to speak openly, right? That is part of the challenge that I have today, training a public body in public like this. There are things I will not say in open session, because it's not appropriate for me to give you legal advice in open session. So, you know, when we get into the nitty-gritty of the Brown Act, I'm happy to talk about hypothetical situations, but I will not answer a question, well, so-and-so said this, is that a Brown Act violation? I'll recast that as a hypothetical. But to the point, attorney-client privilege will attach to that conversation that you're having with your attorney in closed session. And you as trustees need to maintain that privilege unless the board, acting as a whole, a majority of the whole, waives that privilege. And I've only seen that done maybe twice in the 30, almost 1 years I've been doing this. It just doesn't happen that often. And then, again, we talked a little bit about this. You have another duty to encourage honest communication among all of you, to involve all the constituency groups in the governance process, and to also have honest and open communications with those constituency groups. All right, I've been talking a lot. Before I move on and talk about enforcement, are there any questions? Is this all making sense? Any hypothetical questions, I will say? Okay.
We should wait until we get through or not.
It's up to you. I do not mind questions in the middle.
You don't mind questions in the middle?
I do
Okay.
not.
Chairman? is that-
Hypothetical questions.
Of course.
Thank you.
So, are illegal and unauthorized communications of employees or trustees with legal counsel privileged? And specifically, if it is for personal gain?
So the part of that question that I'm that I'm having trouble getting my mind wrapped around is an illegal communication with counsel. So hypothetically, I'm having a hard time imagining what a illegal communication with counsel might be. Generally, communications with one's attorney are privileged if they are in the process of obtaining legal advice. So if the board and I were to have a conversation about the cool playlist that was going on when we all entered the room today, that is not a privileged communication, even though it's between an attorney and client, because it's not for the purpose of obtaining legal advice. Does that help with that question?
Well, let's go with unauthorized, because typically the board acts as a body to authorize interaction with attorneys. If an individual trustee were to contact you on a matter that seemed personal in nature, would that be privileged? Using public resources for that type of
So
situation.
if an individual trustee were to contact me, other than the board president, because there are some things that we interact with the board president on, agenda items and such. If an individual trustee were to reach out to me with a question, I would probably answer the question, but then I would circle back with the board president, and I would refer the trustee to the board president to channel that communication a little better. If the question were about something related to district business, would that communication be privileged? We have an argument that it would be privileged, yes. But it would have to be in the context of obtaining legal advice on behalf of the district.
That answered my question. So what if a staff member discovers that something in closed session had been approved and it wasn't read out? And once they became aware of it, they notified the board attorney, and the board attorney said, just write it in the minutes as if it was reported out. Would that be illegal, or would it need to come back to the next board meeting?
It does sometimes happen that the report out doesn't happen appropriately. I mean, obviously, we always strive to report out appropriately, but sometimes there's a whoopsie or a hiccup. When that happens, we have taken the position that the appropriate action is to bring it back to the very next possible board meeting, make a statement about what happened. The following report outline was inadvertently omitted from last month's board meeting. Here's what we should have reported out last month. And then the report out, in closed session, the board, blah, blah, whatever they did. I would not be comfortable reflecting something in the minutes as having been reported out if there was not in fact a report out, unless there were a notation, a cross-reference to the following month's minutes where it was actually reported out. And even then, I'm not sure if, I'd have to think through if that would be an appropriate notation in the previous month's minutes. Did that make sense?
It does. I only have one more question. So what is a trustee's responsibility to the public if an individual trustee believes an illegal activity has occurred in closed session, and who should they report that to?
Can I hold that question, because I do have some slides on that in the Brown Act.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions before I talk a little more about 2715? Hearing none. So there is an enforcement mechanism in your board policy 2715, and in fact that's there because there's an accreditation requirement for it to be there. The accreditation standards require that we have a board ethics policy. We can call it something else. We call it a statement of ethics. That's fine. But we have to have that, and we have to have some kind of an enforcement mechanism for when there are violations. In your board policy, the process is that the allegations of a violation or a breach of the statement of ethics are forwarded to the board president. There is a investigative fact-finding process where the board president ultimately is responsible to see that something, the board finds out what the facts are underlying this allegation of a violation. There's a written report and recommendation presented to the entire board, and I should note that's in open session. This is not a closed session item. This is an open session item. And if there is a finding of a violation, the board's stick, if you will, is to censure one of the board members, right? You don't have the ability to remove one another from office. You don't have the ability really to restrict their rights or privileges within the board. But what you can do is censure a board member. And I don't know whether there's something in the air in California lately, but I've had probably 3 questions come up in the last 4 or 5 months around censure in districts that are talking about censure or wondering if censure is appropriate. And a question that always comes up is, because it's not a word that we use often in ordinary conversation, what the heck is a censure? And it's really just a statement that the board adopts, usually through a resolution, but not necessarily involving a resolution, but it's a statement that the board adopts that says, Trustee X, you violated our statement of ethics when you did X. And trustee, we think that does not meet our standards of ethics, and we disapprove of your conduct when you did that. That's what a censure, at its very basest and most elemental level, that's what a censure is. It's saying, we disapprove of what you did. All right. Questions? All right. So there's an interesting little wrinkle in the Public Records Act that I wanted to bring to your attention before we move on to some of the other efficacy principles and other fun that's coming our way. And here it is. A Public Records Act request was submitted for all emails or texts sent or received by trustees about the cost of the annual 4th of July celebration. Since the district does not provide phones or email addresses to trustees, so that may not be the case here, but that's the case I'm making in this hypothetical. Since the district does not provide emails or phones to trustees, the district did not search for any documents and did not disclose any records. Is the district's response sufficient? Anyone want to take a stab at this one?
I'd say no.
Anyone disagree? Well, Trustee Kinnaman has the gold star answer. It is not sufficient. So this is based on a case called the City of San Jose. And the facts there were similar to what we've set out here. The local newspaper requested the city council members' emails and texts around a certain issue and on within a certain date frame that would capture some texts that the the council members were exchanging during a meeting. And the City of San Jose said, those are on private devices. Those are not district city devices, so we're not going to search for those. And the Court of Appeal and ultimately the California Supreme Court said, no, nice try, but no. The definition of a public record is some kind of writing, and for the moment, just accept that that includes emails and texts. But it requires, the definition is a writing that touches on or addresses the business of the city. Text messages and emails about this subject matter, and I can't remember what it was, the subject matter, and during this time frame are public records. So you need to go back to those city council members and ask them for their texts off their personal devices and their emails from their personal email accounts. And if this is freaking you out just a little bit, then my work here is done. The cautionary tale I want you all to take away from this is, please use your district-provided email accounts. Please limit your use of your personal email accounts. I do not know who uses or doesn't use their personal or district email accounts, but I am urging you to develop the habit of using your district email account so that we don't end up in this position where we have to come to you someday and say, excuse me, trustees, can I have your personal text messages, please? Because that could be uncomfortable. We would, of course, redact any totally personal conversations, but still, you don't want to be in that position. All right, questions before I move on to efficacy principles? Anything about the role of the board, board ethics, enforcement of board ethics? Yes, ma'am.
The microphone on. One reason why I would have thought that would have been, that wasn't sufficient was because sometimes trustees will text each other on the phone, and I mean, there could have been a serial meeting, which I know we're going to be talking about in a few minutes here, inadvertently, just because they were talking about something and then they talked to somebody else about something and it was on their private device.
It
So that's-
absolutely
yeah.
can happen that way, and you're right, we are going to talk about serial meetings in the Brown Act, under the Brown Act heading, but yes. So the California Supreme Court gave us some guidance around what we have to do to try to collect those. We do not and will not, we're not required to conduct searches of your private devices, so you can all breathe a small sigh of relief. But we do have to make a good faith search if we get a request like that. We do have to make an honest, good faith effort to locate such emails or text messages. So again, I'm not quite begging you, but strongly urging you, please develop the habit of using your district email accounts. And for all I know, you're all perfectly compliant with that request already. All right. Efficacy principles. So I stole my own thunder a little bit about a minute ago. There is an oddity to having to conduct a business, the district's business meeting. That's what this is. Every month, you have a business meeting in front of God and everyone. That's just a little bit goofy. Lots of private entities don't have to do that, and they seem to run just fine. But an underlying principle of the Brown Act is that we are conducting the public's business and we should do it in public unless there is a recognized exception to get us into closed session. But this is your only opportunity. These business meetings are really your only time to get together and to talk about the programs and to talk about students and how students are doing. And it seems it's a little bit awkward or stilted to have to do that in a Robert's Rules of Order kind of public way, but that's what our requirements are. You should be, and you are, setting policy, establishing the budget, hiring people, evaluating your CEO, overseeing the overall conduct of the district's business. But it's kind of, I think, a little bit odd that we do that in public. So how do we do that efficiently? I find it helpful to remember this. You are conducting the district's business. It is a public meeting, but it is still the board's meeting. It is not the public's meeting with the board. It is the board's meeting with yourselves, right, in public. So there's a clear right, and there should be, for the public to come and comment about things within your subject matter jurisdiction, about things that are on your agenda before you take action. That is a core principle of the Brown Act. And it is a transparency law for sure, and it's a good law. But that doesn't transform your business meeting, you trustees, your business meeting into a town hall. You're not engaging in debate with members of the public. You're not getting into conversations with members of the public. They make their comments. We'll talk about it in a minute. You can make a brief response, but you should not be getting into a prolonged conversation with members of the public for a couple of reasons. First of all, that's not really an efficient use of your time, your limited time to conduct the business of the district. Second, if that becomes a significant or substantial conversation, that's not properly on the agenda. Right? We have an obligation, we'll talk about this when we get to the Brown Act, we have an obligation to agendize anything that the board's any action the board is gonna take has to be on the agenda. And if you're getting into a prolonged conversation about paving the parking lots with members of the public, or there's not enough parking, or gee, now there's too much parking, for the first 28 years of my career, all I heard at board meetings was there's not enough parking. Well, the last 2 or 3 years, now I'm hearing, why do we have all these empty parking spaces? So life changes. But that kind of conversation becomes an unagendized board item, and if it's substantial, it could be construed as a violation of the Brown Act. So just as a principle of being efficient and making the most use of your time, remember, keep in mind, this is the board's meeting in public. It is not a public meeting with the board. All right. Now, I know you've all been very patient. This is the part you've all been looking forward to, I know. I know. I'm a geek. I like the Brown Act. Questions about board efficacy or any of those other topics before we move on to Brown Act?
Chairman Stephan, can I ask one more question?
Not right now.
I didn't hear the response, I'm
I
sorry.
don't have any right now.
Okay.
Oh, I was asking if I could ask one more.
Oh, yeah, she asked if you had questions. This is our study session.
Okay. A minute ago, we were talking about public records. So there's apps out there that like Signal and WhatsApp. Are those, I'm going to assume they are.
Signal I am not familiar with, so I'm not gonna, I don't want to speak to that because I really don't know what it is. WhatsApp I have a passing knowledge of. If there are communications on WhatsApp that are between trustees that deal with the conduct of the business of the district, those certainly could be and probably are public records.
Okay.
But that's the problem with hypotheticals. I always want to ask one more fact. So I'm kind of in a catch-22 of my own making.
Thank you.
All right. Brown Act? Brown Act. Okay. So I said this earlier, but it bears repeating. The Brown Act is an open meeting law, sometimes referred to as a transparency law. It is that for sure. One of the fundamental principles is that the board is conducting the public's business in running the Desert Community College District, and it should be conducting that business in public. There are exceptions we'll talk about. There are exceptions for closed session. Those are fairly limited and are very strictly construed. And the presumption is that something should be conducted in open session. I have a rule of thumb I developed very early on in working with the Brown Act, and that is this: there are exceptions, but in general, if you're spending money, you need to be in open session. There are exceptions. Settling a lawsuit is the biggest one that comes to mind. But in general, if you're spending money, you need to be in open session. That's why there are prohibitions in the Brown Act against setting compensation in closed session for your high-level executives. And that's been the case for a long, long time. All right, so the Brown Act applies to meetings of the Board of Trustees. So let's start out with a very basic question: what is a meeting? Well, certainly this is a meeting. We have more than a quorum of the trustees here together in one place and this is the language of the code, to hear, discuss, or deliberate, on an item within your subject matter jurisdiction. So running your meetings, your ethics, Brown Act compliance, all are certainly within your subject matter jurisdiction. So here we are. Thankfully, we happen to have an agenda for today's meeting, otherwise I'd be running out the door right now. So we're good, but this is a meeting. So a board coming to a quorum or more coming together in one place at one time, but put an asterisk there because we're going to come back to that, to hear, discuss, or deliberate on a matter within your subject matter jurisdiction, that's a meeting. Simple enough, except when it's not. All right. A community college held a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newly constructed campus student center. 3 of the 5 board members attended. The members did not discuss any particular issues related to the center's approval, but one of the board members commented that he was elated by the fact the new center would be located near the major street in town. Okay, this is probably a good time for me to say, we don't make up our case studies. These are all something that's happened somewhere along the line, maybe not with a community college district, maybe it was a city or a county or another kind of district, but these have all happened. All right, so under these facts, is there a meeting at the ribbon cutting ceremony? I have one no.
I'm assuming that we've already created the plans for the facility and everything, so you're not deliberating on anything, so I'd say no.
I assume, I mean, we're at the ribbon cutting, so I'm assuming we're down that road. I agree with you on that. Trustee Perez, Trustee Gonzalez, do you want to weigh in? You want to jump in? They did have a brief conversation about the new center being located near a major street. That was a comment by one of the trustees, and it's not clear from these facts, but I assume it was to the other trustees.
That would lead to a perception then that there was a meeting. So then it would be a violation, could be considered a violation of the Brown Act.
So,
I didn't realize it was to another trustee. I thought it was a comment to the public.
so I think this is probably not a technical Brown Act violation, but the note I wrote on my slides is twitchy. This makes me twitchy for exactly the reason that you pointed out, Trustee Stefan, that there might be a perception that the trustees were discussing something more substantive than, gee, I'm glad we're on a major artery. I think that one comment alone is not enough to create a Brown Act violation here, but I am concerned about the perception that there was some kind of shenanigan going on.
I'm getting to this kind of scenario because, I mean, this happens all the time when we're at a ribbon cutting. There might be 3 of us, there might be 4 of us. Very rarely are there less than a majority there. And a lot of times I know that in the past, and I don't know, I guess people think I'm kind of aloof or something, but I'll go sit by myself so that I'm not in a majority sitting arrangement type of situation. And I think that's probably the easiest way to make it clear that we are not in a meeting and that nothing is being discussed. I will say hi to the fellow board members in passing, but not engaged in open conversation for
Yes.
that reason.
So I think that's a good plan, is that the trustees not sit together. I mean, you work together, you come to an event like this, you want to naturally be with each other and celebrate this great accomplishment of this newly created student center. That's great. But I agree. I think, spacing yourselves out among the crowd is a good idea. It also gets you better exposure to members of the community. I do want to point out, there is an exception in the Brown Act for ceremonial kinds of things, but you have to be really careful not to discuss business.
Or not to get the perception, because if you're just talking about, I mean, I could be talking about my ducks or my dog or something to somebody and, we're laugh or, we get serious or, what do you do when the duck doesn't lay the eggs or whatever? And we get into a discussion on it, people might think we're discussing something else. So, even, sitting next to each other, I know that when we do the nurses' pinnings and things like that, sometimes we'll be sitting next to each other. And if somebody's missing, I'll try to make sure that we've got, that empty seat between two and two, and that we're not, talking over the empty seat if something's missing.
Right.
So that, just because there is always that perception that anytime we're in this room together, three people are discussing business, whether we are or not, like we don't have any other life.
Or other interests.
Yeah.
All right, so you correctly predicted that I am going to talk about serial meetings because it's a huge issue. I can remember sitting in my office, there was an email circulating among trustees that I didn't become aware of until all of a sudden I looked up at my email and realized, oh golly, the fourth trustee in a 7-member board just responded to that email. And I won't repeat the word I said, because it's a public session and I have my filters in place. Not often that you see a Brown Act violation happen before your very eyes. So a meeting can occur, certainly this is a meeting, but meetings can occur in other ways, right? It doesn't have to be us all coming together in one place. Informal sessions, so your retreats are meetings and have to be properly agendized. Conferences can be a meeting. There is an exception for public conferences, like I'm sure many, if not all of you, go to the trustees conference that the league puts on, or go to ACCT or any of the other professional organizations that serve trustees. There is an exception for that, so long as you don't discuss business. So you can go to those, and you should go to those. Those are wonderful professional development opportunities. And you can see each other and socialize with each other at those conferences. Just be careful you don't pull yourself into a discussion of a district business. And that's really easy to do because you were just in a wonderful session about student housing, and you come out and it's natural to say, golly, isn't this exciting? We should, now you're discussing district business, and you could very easily end up in Brown Act trouble. It can happen through telephone conversations, either all on the phone at once, or there are two kinds of serial meetings I want to flag for you. The first is called, this isn't a term of art, you won't find it in the Brown Act, but it's referred to as a daisy chain meeting. That's where trustee A talks to trustee B and says, gee, I think student housing is a great idea. I think we should have student housing in our district. And trustee B then talks to trustee C and says, I was just talking to trustee A, and he said he thinks that student housing is great and we should get in student housing. And I think that his position is all wet, and I don't think we should get into student housing. And then trustee C goes and talks to trustee D, and if we're in a 7-member board, now we're at a quorum, and trustee C says to trustee D, A said this and B said this, and I think this. And now what have we got? We've got a serial meeting. So, you are all active members of the community, and I'm sure you run into each other at Starbucks or in the grocery store or out at dinner or whatever from time to time. And, if 2 of you are together, that would not normally trigger you to think about a Brown Act meeting. But please be careful when you are taking, be careful not to, let me say this very clearly and much better, be careful not to carry messages from one trustee to another trustee, because before you know it, you've got a quorum, and in a small board like this, a quorum is only 3. Before you know it, you've got a serial meeting. So please, I really worry a lot about serial meetings. I do. I'm a geek. I get it. The other kind of serial meeting I wanted to flag for you is called a spoke and hub meeting. That's where one person, say trustee A, talks to trustee B, and they have a conversation about student housing. And then trustee A goes to trustee C and says, they have a conversation about student housing that includes the A-B conversation. And now trustee A goes to yet another trustee and has the same conversation and says, oh, and A and B, B and C had the following thoughts about student housing. That is now a spoke and hub serial meeting. That's a little more deliberate than the daisy chain. The daisy chain, it can happen inadvertently, but a spoken hub serial meeting is a little bit more deliberate than a daisy chain. But it is a serial meeting just the same, and not something you should be participating in. Now, I get this question a lot, so let me preemptively address it. What about your superintendent president? She often has conversations with each one of us serially about upcoming board meetings or something that's happened on campus and we all need to know about it. That is fine, so long as your superintendent president doesn't take information from one trustee to another trustee. Your staff, your superintendent president, and other staff, certainly, are absolutely free to meet with you individually, even discussing the same issues, so long as we don't carry information from one trustee to another trustee through an intermediary. As I said, I really do worry quite a bit about serial meetings. I really worry about email. Because as I said, it's so easy to have an inadvertent email violation. There are a couple of ways to do that. The example I gave you when I first started speaking about serial meetings was in the old days. Microsoft has changed how BCC works on in their platform. At the time, if you BCC'd and the BCC replied all, it went to everybody who was addressed to. Now, if a BCC replies all, it just goes back to the person who sent the email and anyone on an open CC. So that would probably not happen today. So a good way to handle communication to all trustees is send it to yourself with a BCC listing all the trustees. That way your trustees, you won't inadvertently email everybody. The other thing that I've seen CEOs do is in the subject matter, just call out, this is a one-way communication, do not reply all. That doesn't prevent the reply all, however, which is my worry. Questions about serial meetings?
Question,
Yes.
the hub and spoke.
Yes.
A lot of times, like a trustee will attend a conference and maybe several trustees to attend the same conference session. And they'll come back and they'll want something on the next agenda. And they send it off to the, each one sends their own little email off to the chair. And the chair, as a chair, usually I just respond, thank you, to each individual that sends me something like that. But I don't comment on that, and then I just try to get it on the earliest agenda that I can get it on. But if I responded to one and then responded to another and another one, would that be considered a serial meeting?
It would probably not be a serial meeting depending on what you said. If you responded substantively, that would still not be a Brown Act violation. But if you responded substantively and carried information from one trustee to another, so from the first trustee who sent it to you to the second trustee to the third trustee, that would now be could be a Brown Act violation.
Or if I made a comment like, oh, so-and-so attended that meeting and so did I, and we all loved it.
Yes.
And we're adding that,
Yes.
that would be a violation.
Yes.
Whereas if I just say, thank you, we'll get it on at the earliest time, it's not a violation.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Other questions? Okay. All right. So the agenda, we have an agenda for all our meetings. The agenda contains the items that the board is going to act on. And there's a requirement in the Brown Act that there is a description of the item to be acted on sufficient to inform the public of what the board is doing. I think of it like this. The agenda should be sufficient so that somebody at home reading the agenda can figure out, do I want to go to all the bother of putting on my shoes and driving down there to attend the meeting? Are we really discussing constructing a new student service, and I know you have a beautiful new building, constructing a new student services building? Or are we talking of reorganization of students, how we offer student services? So we have to have enough detail in that description that a member of the public can figure out what will be considered, but what the board will be considering. There's also a requirement, it doesn't have to be a long description. Generally, it's no more than 20 words. That is in the Brown Act. Generally not more than 20 words. Consent agenda, there is very often a consent agenda. The consent agenda is just really items that are so non-controversial, so mind-numbingly dull that if we had to do them one at a time, first of all, our meetings would take forever, and second of all, we would just all fall asleep. They're just the routine stuff, approval of warrants. Really? We don't need to do that one at a time. The personnel schedule, approval of transfers, approval of acceptance of resignations. Those are very routine things. There is very little law about what can go on consent agenda. There are a few things that are called out in various statutes sprinkled around about what can go on consent, or more often what cannot go on consent. There's something in the PERS statutes that says this type of resolution cannot be on consent. It has to be an action item. But generally, it is up to the CEO and the board president as the constructors of the agenda to figure out what is controversial, what is the board going to be interested in enough that it should be an action item. If something is on the consent agenda and a trustee has a question about it, the trustee can pull that item off the consent. And I'm sure that happens with some regularity. It's either there's a question or so they want to make a comment or something like that. And then what happens is then the consent agenda proceeds without that item, and then we next consider that item. Or some districts also automatically move that into the action items and take it up at that point. It's been properly on the agenda, you can absolutely pull it off from consent to action. All right. Items not on the agenda, I was, I always listen more carefully to the preamble before a board meeting when I'm here to train on board Brown Act issues. You have a wonderful statement at the beginning of your agenda exactly about addressing items that are not on the agenda. The general rule is something has to be on the agenda. The agenda for for a regular meeting has to be posted 72 hours in advance. For a special meeting, it's only 24 hours in advance. There are exceptions for adding items to the agenda. They're fairly rare. Once in a while they come up. An emergency. This is a true emergency, however, not a oops, we forgot emergency, but something has collapsed or is on fire or is coming to get us with the germs and the virus. We have something like that. It has to be a genuine emergency. There is an item that you have called out on your agenda that you can add items that have come to the attention of the district after the time for posting the agenda, but there's a need for immediate action. The board has to approve adding the item by a 2/3 majority. So that's one of the supermajority items I mentioned. And then there's an exception for items that were on the agenda for a previous meeting where the meeting was adjourned, but that has to have happened within 5 days of the current meeting. That does not come up very often. I once had a district where the district office, the boardroom lost power, the whole campus lost power, and they waited 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, and it was clear the power was not coming back on, so they adjourned that meeting and called a special within 2 or 3 days. So we used this provision to add items to that agenda from the adjourned meeting. As I said, not something that happens very often. There are also exceptions for the board to make a brief response, emphasis on the word brief. Generally, we want responses to public comment to be, thank you very much, we'll consider that, or can we ask the superintendent president to look into that and get back to us? That kind of brief comment. As I said, we don't want to get into a protracted discussion about an item that is not properly on the agenda, but we can make that kind of brief comment. You can ask questions for clarification. If you have no idea what the person is talking about, or you want to know more detail about one particular aspect, that is an appropriate clarification question. And you can make brief announcements. You probably even have an item on your agendas for board reports or requests for future agenda items. Those are all appropriate. And then, of course, you can always ask your staff to look into something and get back to you. Or to bring a report back is another thing. All right, We're moving on to another sub-area. No, we are not. My mistake, I skipped a slide. Another issue that comes up from time to time and is sort of related to consent agenda. Trying to remember when it was. Has to be 4 or 5 years ago now. The legislature amended the Brown Act to require that before the board acts on salaries, salary schedules, or fringe benefits for local agency executive, which really just means someone on an employment agreement, a written employment agreement. Before we act on those items for those employees, we have to provide an oral summary of the recommendation for final action, and that has to be done in open session before the board acts. So that typically takes the form of somebody saying, item number 42.8 is a recommendation for compensation for a local agency executive. We're required to give the following oral summary, and then summarize the salary schedule, and fringe. That is a direct result of the City of Bell scandal. If anybody remembers City of Bell. There are a number of changes to the Brown Act that can trace their origins back to the City of Bell. But I interrupted you, Trustee Stefan, I'm sorry.
Well, I have a question on that. That has to be in an action item.
No, it doesn't have to be an action item, but it's kind of awkward if we're doing it on consent.
That's what I was going to say, because consent, usually you just take the whole thing
Right.
and it's done.
So if you had something like this on consent, you could do it that way, but you'd have to do the oral summary before you adopted the consent agenda. So you might as well just, it's not a legal requirement, but as a practical matter, it really means these should be action items. But it's not illegal to put something like this on consent so long as you give the summary. Other questions? You're not asking enough questions. I'm way ahead of my time. All right. The 2022 teleconference amendments, I spoke to you, I think in January, about the history of teleconference amendments going back to what the old language was, the executive orders. I put them in here, just the 2022 teleconference amendments. Those are all that are in effect at the moment, sort of. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So there is still in the Brown Act a provision that in a declared state of emergency, we can meet remotely if we make certain findings around whether the meeting causes health and safety concerns or dangers to attendees. As of February 28th, the governor has lifted the declaration, the COVID declaration of emergency. However, I just wanted to point out that on, I think it was March 2nd, but I might be off by a day here or there, he also declared emergencies in 10 counties in the state of California. Now, if we were to try to take advantage of that declaration of an emergency, first of all, it's only going to last a short time, so it's not a long-term solution to anything. But if we were to try to take advantage of that declaration of emergency to go back to meeting remotely, we would have to make findings that because of the emergency, there is a health and safety component or danger or risk to our attendees. And I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that. I'm not with a straight face. I'm just not sure that's going to work. But I did want to flag, you know, that the state of emergency statement or provision in the Brown Act is still there and is still active. It's just that we don't have a COVID emergency anymore in the state of California. Now, if things backslide, which I'm not hoping for by any stretch, but if either there's a new pandemic or a new emergency, such as the snow emergencies, that may be available to us again, but we still would have to make the findings that we made, all along during the COVID emergency, that there are health and safety risks to meeting in person.
A question on that. And I'm going to use a hypothetical. Hypothetically, we had major physical thing like snow or earthquake or something like that, and we were even unable to utilize the facilities. Could we do a remote meeting to declare the state of emergency?
Yes, under the Brown Act, you can meet remotely for the sole purpose of determining if you can meet remotely going forward.
Okay, until it was resolved or whatever. Okay.
All right, so what do just as a brief refresher, what do the current, brand new teleconference amendments say? Recall that prior teleconference amendments addressed COVID emergencies. I'm going to call them COVID emergencies. These teleconference amendments are based on the circumstances of individual trustees rather than the circumstances of an emergency. Under these new 2022 teleconference amendments, a trustee can meet remotely for just cause, which is defined as a family, childcare, or caregiving need, a contagious illness, so could be COVID, but could also be the flu or a cold or RSV or chicken pox. I mean, could be any kind of contagious disease. Disability, travel on district business, not just vacation travel, but has to be official travel. So that's one, just cause. The second is emergency circumstance, which is some kind of physical or family emergency. My husband was taken ill, or my child is injured or whatever, or there's some kind of a physical emergency at my home, something like that, that prevents me from coming to meet in person. So long as it is a requirement that a quorum of the board still has to meet in person in one location. So the rest of us still have to come to the meeting, or at least a quorum of the rest of us still have to come to the meeting physically in person. The trustee is required to give a general description of the circumstance. You don't have to reveal any kind of medical information, but just, I've had a family emergency, I have a contagious disease, whatever. We don't have to give out medical information, but we do have to say why, what qualifies us to be meeting remotely. And interesting, this just fascinates me. The trustee must disclose if someone over the age of 18 is in the room with them. Okay, we can do that. I'm not sure why, because it's open session. Someone can be there. But it's there, so we'll do it. The interesting and a little bit crazy-making part of this is the trustee can give notice as late as the beginning of the meeting. So let's think about that for a minute. What does that mean for our IT staff? It means that they have to be ready to switch to all Zoom all the time. Well, not all Zoom, but switch to Zoom at the drop of a hat up to the time we start the meeting. Yikes. That's a lot to have to do. I mean, there is a lot the trustees don't see in setting up a Zoom meeting. There is a lot of nitty-gritty stuff that has to take place and has to be double-checked and has to be lined up and working properly, so that the people on the streaming or Zoom can hear and see. We also have to take public comment. If a trustee is Zooming, we have to take public comment off that Zoom platform or whatever platform we're using. So that's crazy. Yes.
Question on that.
Yes, ma'am.
On the previous slide, it said a quorum of the board must be in person in a single location. Well, we have a 5-member board. If we had 3 people that called in at the very last minute, we would not have that quorum.
Correct.
So
You
we'd
could
have to
not-
reschedule the meeting then.
Correct. You have to have a quorum together in a single location as posted on your agenda. So the trustee must have two-way audio, visual, or telephone platform. So it has to be something, either a combination of phone and live stream or something like Zoom. The trustee has to use both audio and visual, so you have to have your camera on. And there are time limitations. 3 consecutive months or 20% of your regular meetings, so long as you have at least 12 meetings a year. It's another number if you have less than that, and none of my clients have less than that, so I haven't committed that number to memory. And it sunsets in January 2026, but I will buy you all a fancy coffee beverage if the legislature does not tinker with this before January 2026. They are going to mess with this, I promise you. There will be further amendments to the teleconferences.
Another question.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, audio, visual, cameras must be on. In the past when we did the Zoom meetings, people would turn their camera off periodically. Are they allowed to do that or must it be on the whole time?
So it is only the trustees who have to have their cameras on. And that's what the language says. So if
So if they have to go to the restroom,
Right.
maybe they're getting sick or something, they have to just leave the camera on?
I cannot imagine that if a trustee turned the camera off for a moment, that there would be.
Well, it might be 5 minutes,
Yeah.
if they're sick,
But a brief period compared to
as
the.
long as they had their audio left on, because I'm sure they would be Zooming rather than just an audio.
Well, and, trustees can step out of a live meeting just
Yeah.
the same.
Yeah.
So I don't think the equivalent of stepping out of a meeting to use the restroom, to be ill, whatever, would be a Brown Act violation. But that language is in the code.
Yeah, that's why I was like, okay, how strict are they on this?
Other questions? Okay. All right, closed session. Oops, sorry, closed session. The general rule is no closed sessions. Generally, the public's business has to be in public. There are a handful, maybe 20 or so, recognized exceptions. I'm not going to go through them all because some of them will never, ever come up. But the most common are pending litigation, and the technical agenda language is conference with legal counsel, pending litigation or anticipated litigation. And that has to be for the purpose of meeting with your lawyer to talk about your case. You can't put that item on the agenda and then just talk among yourselves. You have to be in closed session to get an update or to get legal advice in some way from your counsel. I once had was anticipating being called into a closed session under pending litigation, and the CEO said, oh, never mind, I just handled that. You just handled that? You have to have a lawyer in closed session, either in person or on Zoom or on the phone. The purpose of that exception is to get legal advice. Personnel matters, so there are a number of personnel matters you see fairly commonly on public employee discipline, dismissal, release, public employment, public appointment. Those are the most common ones, I think. Conference with labor negotiator, that is where you give direction and guidance and authority to your labor negotiator. You'll have a discussion about where we are with negotiations, and your negotiator will say, can I put another 0.5% on the table? Yes or no. That you're giving direction and giving authority to your labor negotiator. Obviously, you don't want to do that in open session. That would defeat the purpose. So that can be in closed session. Similar with real property transactions. So this is often sale or purchase of some type of real estate. And the items that can be discussed in closed session are very limited. Price and terms of payment. So if you're having a discussion about whether you want to be in this part of town or in that part of town, those are not appropriate for closed session. The only thing you can discuss about real property in closed session is price and terms of payment. All right. So we talked about this a little bit when we were going over the ethics part of the presentation. The information that comes to you in closed session is confidential. It's the information that you come to by being in closed session or by being a trustee in closed session is confidential information. That is a very important, it's almost goes without saying, except of course I'm saying it, that information is very closely protected. We wouldn't, it would seriously jeopardize our ability to purchase real property if the seller knew what our bottom line authority was, or what our terms of payment, what terms of payment we would accept. Similarly with labor negotiations, similarly with our litigation strategy. You can see those are very important and very closely held information. And no one can compel you to, nor can you voluntarily disclose what happened in closed session, who said what in closed session. You can't disclose anything. No one can. And this is not just limited to trustees. This applies to any employees or vendors or anyone who's present in closed session. You can't disclose what happened in closed session. Who said what? Who thought this about that? Who thought the other? That's not to become public information. There are sanctions for improper disclosure, including for employees' discipline, and for anyone potential referral to the district. I didn't have it listed here, but to the district attorney or the grand jury, and I believe the attorney general also has jurisdiction. So this goes back to your question earlier, Trustee Kinnaman. There are exceptions, very limited exceptions. You can discuss what happened in closed session solely for the purpose of challenging whether it was appropriate in the first place, and to make those disclosures to either the district attorney, the grand jury, et cetera, where you are, as I said, challenging or questioning or asking for an examination of whether the closed session was an appropriate closed session, but it's limited to that purpose. Right. So did that answer your question? Okay, good, thank you.
Another question on that one. Let's say an individual was let go and they decided to come back and take the district to court. And board members were called on to testify in court on what went on in closed session. They don't have to disclose, is that correct?
They do not, and your lawyer would normally bring, now I get to show off and use lawyer-like terms. Your lawyer would normally bring what's called a motion to quash that subpoena. It's a fancy lawyer term for dismissing any subpoena to try to compel your recollections about what happened in closed session, who said what. Now, the vote, we have to report out the vote ultimately with employee discipline or employee releases during probation. Those reports are normally deferred until the appeal rights, whatever those might be, until the appeal rights are exhausted. So you may, now I'm making this up, you may take action tonight to terminate someone, but they have an appeal right, and that action you may not report that action for months, sometimes even longer. But ultimately, the vote will be reported out tonight, or it would be reported in several months. So someone would report on March 8th in closed session, the board by a vote of 4-1, and we have to report the names that go with that. 4-1 took action to terminate a widget technician 2. That action has now become final. And that report you may not make for until months down the road.
Chairman Steph, go ahead.
If the attorney did not quash the trustee being called, would the trustee be in their right in just saying repeatedly, or would they be found in contempt of court if they just repeatedly said, I'm sorry, that's closed session information and it's violation of the Brown Act if I report out?
I would want to work on that objection, but yes, that would be an appropriate response if there were no motion to quash. But should that ever happen, please, please, please get your lawyer to bring a motion to quash. That's just easier and much less stressful for you. I mean, to have to object on your own during a deposition or live testimony, that would be horribly stressful for you.
I did have another question. This is hypothetical.
Of course.
In
Thank you.
closed session, you said we can only talk about price and terms on property transactions.
Mm-hmm.
If it goes much broader than that, and it includes locations and staff are involved in the closed session, can they be deposed and testify?
That's an interesting question. So to clarify your question, you're asking if staff can be required to testify about what happened in closed session to establish that there was a violation?
Yes.
That's an interesting question. I do not have a definitive answer for you. I apologize. I would want to check two things. I would want to check the language of the code. So there are 2 or 3 code sections that talk about this area, the remedies for violations of the Brown Act. I would want to check those. And I would want to check to see if there are any Attorney General opinions that address a similar question, because got a vague memory that there is an AG opinion that talks about that, but it's a vague memory and I can't remember what the opinion says.
Counsel, I have a question as a lawyer. Excuse me, Board. But under certain circumstances, judges can override claim privileges. Is anything that you're talking about today subject to the jurisdiction of a judge that can say, I'm ordering you to release this information?
Trustee Stefan, I am asking you for direction as to whether I should respond to a question from the public.
I'll let you respond after our meeting.
Thank you.
And then I had another question, sorry, I hope it's my last one. What is the remedy of a serial meeting that decided an action in that serial meeting and was later voted on in public that mirrored the serial meeting discussion?
So before anyone can bring an action challenging a Brown Act violation, that person has to make what's called a demand to cure or correct. So they have to tell the district, hey, district, I think you've violated the Brown Act on this date in this way. And the board, or whatever governing body, then has the opportunity to cure that violation. Sometimes that's a do-over, which is kind of what you're describing, that the board can properly agendize the matter and then consider it again. Then that second action would control or cure the violation.
Okay, thank you.
All right, report out. We've talked a little bit about reporting out. Generally, in closed session, the board has to report out actions taken in closed session and the vote or abstention of each member. So report out, I'm going to make a silly example because I think they're fun and they keep me out of trouble sometimes. This evening in closed session by a vote of 4-1, trustees A, B, C voting in the affirmative and trustee D of E voting in the negative, the board adopted a resolution to declare that broccoli is good for us. Now, of course, broccoli isn't an appropriate closed session topic, but let me have my fun. So we have to report out the action taken and the vote or abstention of each member. Now, if that had been unanimous, we could have just said unanimous. If it were unanimous but somebody was absent, we would have to report that as well. Unanimous of those present with trustee X absent. There are a few times when, as I explained earlier, we defer report out. Those have mostly to do with personnel actions when there's some kind of an appeal or a remedy. What we report depends on what the action was, right? If we're in closed session for conference with a labor negotiator and all we did was give direction, that is not an action. That doesn't have to be reported out. You can report in closed session, the board gave direction to its labor negotiator. Similar with litigation, pending litigation. You don't if you're just getting an update or you're just giving direction, that you can either report nothing or report we gave direction. The other thing you can do is so that when you come out of closed session, you don't just not say anything. You can also say the board took no reportable action in closed session. You know, and that's to a point, whether you report no reportable action or we gave direction, that's a preference and a style and a philosophical discussion or issue. Um, Any of them are legally compliant. But if the board took action, so if in closed session you settled a case, you authorized a case to be resolved for a payment of money, you need to report that out. By a vote of blank to blank, the board settled litigation in this case on and generally what the terms are on these terms. If you resolved, if you have a pending disciplinary appeal and you settled that in closed session by accepting the employee's resignation, allowing the employee to resign, you would report that out as well because you accepted a resignation in closed session. That has to be reported out. And remember, Eileen's rule, in general, you can't spend money in closed session. If you're spending money, generally, you should be in open session.
Okay, question on that. You know, most of the time we report out, board took no reportable action. If you make a general statement about one of the items on the thing, should you be making a general statement that the board gave direction? You know, like a general statement for the other items that were in closed session, or?
You can come out and say, instead of saying the board took no reportable action, you can say the board gave direction on the items on the closed session agenda, or the board gave
Just in
direction
general.
on
Okay.
items 1, 2, 3, however you
And
list
then
them.
not say anything on the others, or there was no other reportable action?
You can say there was no other reportable action, that's fine. So open or closed session, we've got some hypotheticals for you. The superintendent president wants to update the board on a contract grievance arbitration. Open or closed?
Closed.
Closed.
I agree, closed. That would go under pending litigation. But remember two things. First of all, if you're under pending litigation, you need to have a lawyer in there talking to you, or on the phone or Zoom. You know, you need to be receiving advice from your lawyer. And the teaching point on that, on this slide is, it's, the litigation privilege is bigger than just, not the litigation privilege, the litigation closed session item is bigger than just lawsuits. You know, it applies to administrative proceedings, it applies to grievance arbitrations, other types of arbitrations. All right, the board wants to discuss budget with its labor negotiator.
That would be closed because you're setting the parameters for the labor negotiator.
If that's what we're doing, I agree. But if we're really discussing budget, that should be an open session. So I could see a time where we would have a budget discussion in open session, and then at that closed session, have a closed session item that says, okay, we just set a budget that is cutting everything by 45%. I'm making up stupid numbers. We just set a budget that cut everything by 45%. Here is your new direction, labor negotiator. Here's what this means for our negotiations. Oops, I'm sorry, I skipped one. I skipped two. The board wants to meet with legal counsel to understand options for hiring procedures. And just to make this more interesting, hiring procedures for its CEO.
Open.
I agree. hiring procedures generally are going to be open session. Now, you can go into closed session if you get to when you get to the point at which you are crafting interview questions for your finalists. Absolutely, you can go into closed session. That would be a perfectly appropriate use of the closed session exception for public employment or public appointment either. Last one, board wants to discuss a board member conflict of interest issue. Open. Board members are not employees, so we can't go into closed session under the personnel exception. There's no threatened litigation or no pending litigation, so you can't go in under that. I have not been able to come up with a way to do something like this to discuss a conflict in closed session. And truthfully, I'm not sure that I would look too hard. This kind of discussion needs to be an open session. Public needs to hear about this. All right, you didn't ask enough questions. I am way ahead of time, but I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, I have some questions. You have to excuse me, I'm kind of losing my voice. No, I've had this for about 3 weeks or so, but I test negative, you guys are safe. I wouldn't put you in danger like that. Question, what if an administrator or a trustee discloses closed session information? I know you went over what happens here, but what does that process look like?
So there are several things that could happen. Sometimes they happen together, sometimes it'll only be one of them, but whoever learns about it, whether it's another trustee, member of the public, whoever, could make a report to either the district attorney. Most district attorneys, certainly one in a county this size, has a public integrity unit. So you could make a report to the district attorney. You could make a report to the civil grand jury. As I said, I think, I'd have to double check this. I believe the Attorney General also has jurisdiction over Brown Act violations. I would want to confirm that. And then the other thing that could happen that I didn't mention in my slide but is available to the district is the board could authorize the district to obtain an injunction against that trustee from making further disclosures of protected, confidential, closed session information.
Does a PRA include closed session documents?
No. Those are generally exempt.
Okay. So given all of this information, I do want to thank you for a very comprehensive and cohesive presentation.
Thank you.
So what is the process or what happens if a trustee discusses personnel issues during open session that are not agendized, that are not on the agenda?
So I would, someday I'm going to make a presentation that is entitled Trustees Behaving Badly. The first line of defense would be, so if it is a confidential personnel information about somebody's performance or about something that happened in closed session or something like that, The first line of defense would be to call the trustee out of order. The board president, and I'm so sorry, Trustee Stefan, a lot of this falls to whoever is sitting in the president's seat. But the board president or board chair would call the trustee out of order. Trustee so-and-so, you're out of order, you're discussing confidential information from closed session. And then there may be some brief discussion back and forth about that, but that, I would hope, that would, at least for that meeting, cease that disclosure. Then, again, this is going to fall to the board president. I would expect that the board president and the trustee who was making the disclosure would have a conversation about, is there a way, how do we deal with this? Is there a way to make this happen? Is there a way for me to make my comments without outing confidential information or disclosing confidential information? Is there some lesser disclosure that would be appropriate? So just the trustee and the board president or board chair to try to work that out. And then ultimately, if it were to continue, you could, and if it's confidential information from closed session, you could go the route we just discussed. You know, the report to the DA, report to the grand jury, potentially getting an injunction against revealing further information. And then the other the other part of this is under your standard, your ethical standards or ethical statement in 2715, that would likely be, I mean, I'd want to look at that again more closely with this situation in mind, but that is likely a violation of your ethical obligations under your board policy, and you could proceed with that as well. The board as a whole could walk through that enforcement process I talked about earlier.
And just to circle back a little bit on your attorney-client privilege on those slides. So any communication between an attorney and, say, a trustee or administrator, are those documents confident?
If there are documents between an attorney and a client representative, normally those are, and they relate to the representation, right? Normally those are privileged, yes. I mean, that's a very abstract question, so you're getting a fairly abstract answer, but yes, those, I would expect those to be privileged.
I mean, such as like an email.
Yes, it could be an email, but it would have to be related to, again, seeking or obtaining legal advice, right? If we're exchanging brownie recipes, no, but if we're talking about, you know, gee, in the upcoming board meeting, I think this is going to happen, I want you to be ready, or how should I respond, that is likely privileged.
If a trustee, say, is utilizing what you've already stated is out of order, to discuss personnel issues, but what if a trustee's comments are harassing towards any management staff member or otherwise? Would that be the same process?
So that I would expect, I mean, just as I sit here thinking about that, I would expect that to go through the ethics violation process first. And when you say harassing, are we talking about harassing on the basis of a protected status, such as race, gender, disability, et cetera, or harassing meaning more like bullying?
I think that's a fine line between those, right?
It can be a fine line between them, and one can't always discern whether something is based on protected status or not. So there's also a very robust and very well-developed board policy and procedures that the district has around complaints about harassment and discrimination. So those would come into play at some point as well.
I might have another one, but let me think of how I want
Certainly.
to formulate it. I don't know if anyone else has questions.
I think Trustee Gonzalez was able to highlight a few questions that I have, but one question that I do have is it appropriate for a board member to direct staff, faculty, to report directly to them or the board and not necessarily the superintendent president?
No, that would not normally be appropriate. I mean, if there were a particular issue that had arisen, perhaps, like I have seen where the board has placed a superintendent president on leave. In that case, if the board hasn't yet put someone into that role, and there, by the way, there is an accreditation requirement that you have someone in that role. If you haven't yet placed somebody in that role, and you're in the budget process, I could easily see saying to the vice president of business or finance or whatever your title is, please, I know now I'm really gonna start making stuff up. I know the 311 is due tomorrow, please, if you have questions, direct them to me. I mean, that wouldn't really happen, but I could see in an extraordinary circumstance, something like that. But generally, no. That would be a trustee becoming involved in the operational detail of running the college, and that could result in an accreditation finding if it were persistent. I mean, one single incident is not likely to create an accreditation issue, but a pattern of that kind of thing, yes, could.
Yeah, I had one more. Yeah, just one more question. Going back to the Public Records Act, what is the penalty or enforcement if staff were directed to delay or deny a response even though those records are readily available?
So the Public Records Act, let me back up and give a little context if I may. The Public Records Act requires us to make public records, that is to say documents about the district's business, available for inspection or copying. Once we get a Public Records Act request, we have 10 days to look at the request and say, okay, we'll produce these and these, but these documents are exempt and we don't have any of these. So we provide a written response within 10 days. Then we must make the records available promptly. Now, promptly is one of those words that I love because I'm a lawyer, but it's not exactly specific. It doesn't say 10 days or 15 days or whatever. It says promptly. If a Public Records Act request produces thousands of documents, that's going to take some time to produce. But if the documents, as you said, are readily available and there is delay, the remedy or the enforcement action is by the requester bringing a specialized type of lawsuit called a writ against the district. And a writ is just a specialized kind of lawsuit asking the Superior Court to order, in this case, the district to do something or not do something. So it would be seeking an order from the Superior Court ordering the district to produce the documents. The other hammer that the Superior Court has that you all should be aware of is there is an attorney's fees provision in the Public Records Act. So the district could be responsible for the requester's attorney's fees. The reverse is very rarely true. The district almost never gets attorney's fees against the requester unless it's just an outrageously frivolous lawsuit. That was a very long answer.
just one more before my voice completely gets lost. As a trustee, or in our trustees in general, are we allowed to, or do we have the authority to possess records, whether confidential or not?
Can I restate the question so I'm sure I understand it? Can a trustee request documents under the Public Records Act?
No.
Okay.
Does a trustee have the authority to possess documents, whether confidential or not? Just for me to
Oh.
kind of discern in my possession, like remove them from this space.
So, yes and no. How's that for a lawyer's answer? A trustee necessarily comes into possession of confidential documents. You receive copies of disciplinary documents before they are presented or after they're presented to the employee. You get litigation strategy memos. You get negotiation strategy. You get lots of documents that you have the right to possess, but normally those are collected again or retrieved in some way when you no longer have a need for them. So once the board considers the disciplinary action, I've been in many a board meeting where we collect all those up and we count them before we leave closed session. I've done that many times. I have districts that I work with that number them to make that easier. So we know very easily, did we get everybody's back and who's missing if we didn't. So yes, you have a right to come into possession of them, but at the risk of making a political joke, you don't have the right to keep them in Mar-a-Lago, right? You don't have the right to maintain them in your home or in an unsecure place once their usefulness is at an end, once you no longer need them.
Thank you.
I'm sure there will be really additional questions from the board. I know we have another study session coming up. I wanted to do these in two things.
Trustee Stefan, your microphone.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I wanted to thank you, Eileen. I know that some of the trustees may have additional questions, but I know we have another study session coming up on Monday on ethics and training. And, I'm sure that, any board member would feel free to bring back any questions that they have at that time
Absolutely.
for any
Absolutely.
responses. And I think this is very informative and very helpful. And I know that, everyone here has been trained probably repeatedly on the Brown Act, but I know it's forever changing, and I know that there are always questions. And, by the examples, you can see that there's many ways you can interpret, what's going on and, make an error in judgment even. So I think these are very beneficial trainings that we have. And I don't want to belabor the thank you, and waste any more of my board members' time, but I think this was a beneficial meeting, and I hope that, they'll all be here on Monday for that one on ethics as well. So thank you again.